Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 5th Annual Go Clean Energy Conference. I'm Diane Hodiak, Executive Director of 350 Deschutes. And before we get started on our next session on EV charging, I would like to make a couple of announcements. And that is, I'd like to thank our generous volunteers, sponsors, speakers, moderators, and especially those sponsors that are making this free event possible, such as Pure Light Power, Ledge Capital, Pacific Power, Deschutes County Solid Waste, Energy Trust of Oregon, G5, Neil Kelly, National Car Charging, MindClick, First Interstate Bank, and Republic Services. Please honor them with your business when appropriate, and you can learn more about them by visiting the expo page at the gocleanenergy.org website. I'd also like to make sure that you keep in mind our next panel, which is the Managing Construction Waste and Demolition, and as well as tomorrow, which will be our Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy panel, as well as Solar for Everyone. And I would also like to remind people that we will have questions and answers with this session, and they will begin at the conclusion of the presentations. So before we get started, I'd like to encourage you to enter those questions into the Q&A, but you may also make comments or introduce yourself into the chat if you find that appropriate. But either way, we'll make sure that we try to answer as many questions as we can. Right now, I'd like to introduce Jeff Gurman of National Car Charging, who will be the moderator for this session.
Thank you, Diane. Welcome, everyone, to our presentation today. We have a very exciting panel. I think it's going to tie together some of the other previous panels that we've had in the last day and a half, if you've attended them, regarding the EV charging world and how it is ever changing. So today's panel will have Jillian Dimedio, Zach Henkin, and Diane Hodiak. And without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Jillian Dimedio from ODOT. Thank you very much.
All right, just sharing my screen here. Oh, there we go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jeff. My name is Jillian Dimedio. I am a Senior Transportation Electrification Analyst with the Oregon Department of Transportation in our Climate Office. First, I just want to thank 350 Deschutes for inviting me today. I'm excited for this opportunity to talk a little bit about ODOT's leading role and our efforts to drive transportation electrification in Oregon. And today in particular, I'm going to be talking about our recently completed Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, which we lovingly refer to as the TEINA study, because it is quite the mouthful. So you'll hear me say TEINA study many times throughout this presentation. We began work on this study about a year ago under the direction of Governor Kate Brown through Executive Order 2004. And really the purpose is to better understand what our EV charging infrastructure needs in Oregon will be over the next 15 years if we're going to meet some very aggressive zero emission vehicle targets. So I'll talk about some of our key findings and really what our office plans to do in terms of next steps. So before jumping into TEINA, I did want to provide a little bit of background and Oregon-specific context so you can really get a glimpse of why transportation electrification in Oregon is so important. Many of you probably know that in Oregon, much like nationally, the transportation sector is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, comprising about 40% of total emissions in the state. So really, if we're going to achieve our statewide climate goals and do our part to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, it's absolutely essential that we address emissions from the transportation sector. So with this in mind, back in 2013, ODOT completed a statewide transportation strategy, which was basically a vision for how we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector to meet our 2050 climate goals. So part of this analysis included looking at where our current policies and investments would take us, what we're calling a business as usual scenario, and then comparing that really to where we needed to go to meet those 2050 goals. And what we found is that while business as usual would result in some progress, it definitely was not enough to meet those goals. And that's the gap that you see illustrated here in this graph. The transportation strategy then looked into a mix of policies and priorities and found that it was doable to close that gap. And as you can see, the most significant thing that we can do is really address the vehicles that we drive and the fuels that we're using, and make sure every mile driven is a clean one. So transportation electrification really is a critically important component to our statewide climate goals. And luckily in Oregon, we are actually very well poised for this transition. We have a long track record of promoting electric vehicles in the state. And really for the last decade, agencies like ODOT and all of our sister partner agencies throughout state government have been working hard to establish a number of policies and programs that will be necessary to ensure a robust and equitable transition. There are, of course, many factors that are contributing to the momentum for electric vehicles, including market forces and improvements in technology. But climate policies at the federal and state level also play a very key role. And as mentioned, Oregon is a leader in these types of policies that spur EV adoption. So I can't go into detail here, but I do want to highlight a few quickly. We were early adopters in Oregon of California's low emission vehicle standards, including the zero emission vehicle mandate. And this was highlighted recently in some research as one of the most effective policies that a state can adopt to drive EVs. And we're also considering a similar policy for medium and heavy duty trucks through an advanced clean trucks rulemaking that is currently underway by our partners at the Department of Environmental Quality. In addition, for a number of years now, we've offered cash on the hood rebates for the purchase or lease of new and used EVs. And that rebate amount does go up if you're an income qualified resident of Oregon. We're also one of the few states offering a low carbon fuel standard. This is our Clean Fuels program, also run through the Department of Environmental Quality. And the Clean Fuels program aims to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, and in doing so, helps to monetize these reductions, including for EV charging station owners. And then in 2019, the Oregon legislature actually passed Senate Bill 1044, which established some aggressive goals around zero emission vehicle adoption in Oregon. And I'll touch more on Senate Bill 1044 in some upcoming slides. I will say that despite all of these efforts, we have still fallen short of the legislature's target for 2050, which was 50,000 zero emission vehicles on the road. We're currently at about 38,000 here in Oregon. So clearly we need to do more, and in particular, it's widely recognized that charging infrastructure really plays a key role in driving EV adoption. So that brings us to our TEINA study, which is really the topic of conversation today. As I mentioned earlier, ODOT undertook this study at the direction of Governor Brown through Executive Order 2004. And there were really two key goals of this study. The first was to evaluate future charging infrastructure needs for light duty vehicles and other modes of electric transportation. So basically what we did here was we looked at the goals of Senate Bill 1044 and basically operated under the assumption if we were able to meet these goals, what kind of charging infrastructure would be needed to support those vehicles. And so I do want to reiterate that this was a needs analysis and not a forecast for EV charging in Oregon. The second objective was basically to recommend a suite of policies and implementation priorities that would help accelerate the deployment of EV charging infrastructure. So I'll talk about some key highlights, but I would highly encourage folks that have the interest and the time to go on our website and take a look at the study, or at least the executive summary. I'll actually post it in the chat after this presentation so that folks can find that. So before jumping into study conclusions, I'll talk a little bit about project approach. The study focused on light duty cars and trucks, while also considering at a higher level the needs of other use cases like transit and school buses, commercial delivery vehicles, long haul trucking, and electric micromobility. And the consultants team really started off with a review of existing conditions. We wanted to establish a baseline for Oregon. So get a better understanding of where are we seeing the highest adoption rates of zero emission vehicles, where is charging infrastructure located right now, and what type of infrastructure is it? We then moved on to a literature review, which was really completed to better understand how Oregon stacks up to other leading states in this area, as well as nationally. And the purpose here was really to identify activities and benchmarks that we could learn from and then hopefully emulate in our state. There was a robust stakeholder engagement process. We had 12 different listening sessions that were focused by use case, a very diverse 17-member advisory group that was given multiple opportunities to weigh in throughout the study process. And in addition, ample opportunities for the public to weigh in as well. Lastly, of course, there was the modeling component, which included a 4-step approach to analyze, identify, and allocate chargers geographically that were needed to meet our goals over the next 15 years. So it probably won't come as a big surprise to folks that pay attention to the EV industry, but basically our TEINA modeling told us that there really is an extraordinary need for charging infrastructure growth throughout the state, not only by 2035, but also within the next 5 years. So we're looking at really a 5-fold increase by 2025 and a 44-fold increase by 2035. And this is true across all sectors. So for medium and heavy duty vehicles and charging as well. But I will say that the light duty public charging needs are really an order of magnitude greater than those for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So as you can see here, the challenge ahead is enormous. And we really do have a lot of work to do if we want to reach our goal and our vision of providing Oregonians with the confidence that EV charging will be as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline. So in addition to our modeling, the TEINA study also identified some key infrastructure goals that will really serve as a lens through which we will view our programs and priorities moving forward. So I'll just quickly run through these. We, of course, need rapid deployment of EV charging infrastructure, as already mentioned. So we really need to be marshaling all public and private stakeholders and funding opportunities to ensure that this happens. And as we do so, we need to make sure that we're considering equity as we design our programs and site infrastructure. In addition, we need to make sure that charging is user-friendly, convenient, safe, and consistent. So right now we're looking at adopting some minimum standards to ensure that this is the case and to instill that confidence that charging an EV can be as easy and predictable for consumers as filling up at a gas station. We need to find ways to lower electric fueling costs, particularly for those without access to home charging. We know right now that public charging typically costs between 3 and 5 times more than charging at home. So this means researching and focusing on policies that will keep prices affordable for all. Utility engagement is, of course, a critical component. Utilities are key stakeholders, of course, as fuel providers. So we really need all public and private utilities to embrace electric vehicles. That includes our investor-owned utilities as well as our consumer-owned utilities. And lastly, we'll be working on establishing a number of foundational policies and resources that will really help accelerate this transition to EVs. So this includes policies on workforce development, stronger building codes and ordinances, and robust technical resources as well. So I do want to highlight a few other key takeaways here. First, I'll mention that in Oregon, there are some very significant charging deserts throughout the state, not just in rural areas as might be expected, but in some urban areas as well, particularly in those areas with high densities of low and moderate income folks, apartment dwellers, or townhouses. Public investment has a very key role to play in this transition, particularly in those areas with lower than average EV adoption, where the private sector is more hesitant to invest due to a not as well-established business case. I've already mentioned that equity needs to be a top consideration, but that means that as we plan our programs moving forward, we're going to find ways to really prioritize investment in low income and BIPOC communities. Infrastructure precedes EVs. So this is kind of an answer to that age-old question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. At this point, we know that infrastructure is an extremely important component in terms of driving EV adoption. And contemporary studies actually suggest that infrastructure should be in place about 2 to 5 years prior to mainstream EV adoption. Home charging is a critical component. So I didn't mention this, but this was definitely a consideration in our modeling efforts. Right now, about 80% of charging needs occur at home nationally. And this will continue to be an important component moving forward, but it will decrease over time as EV adoption becomes more mainstream and more folks drive EVs that maybe don't have access to at-home charging. And basically what that means is that a more robust public charging network is critical to mainstream EV adoption. And lastly, I'll end with this concept of it really does take a village. We know that we all need to work together, both the public and private sectors, to really ensure a robust and fast transition and treat this issue with the urgency that it deserves. And especially utilities, they already play a huge role and they will continue to play a huge role moving forward. Utility actions and outlook are really critical to this transition. So in terms of next steps, our office is currently working on a zero emission vehicle charging infrastructure deployment strategy. This is our attempt to really take the findings of the TEINA study from a 30,000 foot level and bring it down to the ground level and really look at where we need to be siting EV charging infrastructure in the next 2 to 5 years specifically. In addition, we're working really hard to secure funding to hopefully release a slate of EV charging incentive programs. ODOT has some funding that it will be committing to some programs, but we're also seeking out wherever possible other funding opportunities and especially federal funding opportunities. We'll be coordinating extensively with utilities, other state agencies, and other stakeholders moving forward through a series of working groups and public processes to take some of the policy recommendations from the TEINA study and get to work on them. And we'll also, of course, be leading by example by working to transition our own state fleet at ODOT and adopt electric vehicles as quickly as possible. And then lastly, we are working on a couple supplemental analyses, namely looking at hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and what role they may play in this transition, and then of course micro mobility as well. So looking at e-bikes and e-scooters. So I think I'm over time here, but I'll just quickly, I'm sure folks are interested in this slide in particular. I just want to talk a little bit about a new initiative that we hope to release called the Plugging in Oregon program. As we know from the TEINA study, there are major EV charging infrastructure gaps throughout Oregon, particularly though in rural, BIPOC, and low-income communities. And we also know that significant state and federal investment will be needed to plug these gaps. So the Plugging in Oregon initiative is really our attempt to take the TEINA findings to heart and put our money where our mouth is. This is our slate of proposed EV charging incentive programs that we really hope to release in the coming years. The need, as you've seen today, is really too great to address with a one-size-fits-all approach. So we are envisioning a three-pronged incentive program approach, with each of these programs really designed to meet a specific need or gap within the EV charging landscape in Oregon. All of these programs will have a strong equity focus. And really what that means is that we're going to be targeting those harder to reach communities specifically. So looking at rural, BIPOC, and underserved communities. And making sure that in Oregon we can get beyond this early adopter phase of electric vehicles and make sure all Oregonians are able to take advantage of the many benefits of driving an electric vehicle. And so just a quick word on each of these programs. Our community program right now, we're looking at funding level 2 charging stations. Through our urban core program, we're looking at addressing one of the barriers to charging for residents of multi-unit dwellings. So a lot of folks that live in multi-unit dwellings don't have access to at-home charging. So we're looking at community fast charging hubs through our urban core program. And lastly, through our corridor program, we're hoping to fill in some of the gaps along our major corridors throughout the state with DC fast charging again, particularly in Central and Eastern Oregon. And so while we do recognize that obviously the funding is a very important component, outreach, education, and technical assistance are also extremely important, particularly for those who have limited resources and expertise. So we're currently also evaluating opportunities to really incorporate these services into our program design. So these programs are all in development phase right now, both in terms of the details, but also our funding sources and amounts. So the best I can say is to please stay tuned if you're interested in this, and we'll hopefully have more information for you soon. So thank you. That is it for me. This is how you can contact me. And yeah, I look forward to continuing the discussion in our Q&A. I'll hand it back over to Jeff.
Thanks, Jillian. Great news. And I want to say that I participated in some of the citizen side of the TEINA study the last year, and it's really exciting to see what's going to happen. Our next guest and panelist is Zach Henkin. He is now the director for the Center for Sustainable Energy. He's based in the Portland area. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me get my slides up here. Cool, I think you can see that. All right, so happy to chat. My name is Zach Henkin. I'm the Director of EV Program Research for the Center for Sustainable Energy. Big thanks to Diane, Hodiak, and Deschutes 350 for convening this conversation. I think it's a good one, and the more people we can influence and help transition to a fossil-free economy, the better. So you might not know who Center for Sustainable Energy is, but I have a slide for that. So we're a national nonprofit that does work to advance largely EVs and EV charging. We run a lot of infrastructure programs around the country, including the one in California and New York, also rebate programs. It pertains to this conversation, especially because of the hands and that support in EV infrastructure and incentives, and the amount of data that you can get that shows the trends and what is going on with those charging stations. So this is what I am seeking to cover. I want to slow down, back up a little bit, talk about just some basic EV charging 101 for those EV curious, talk about the grid and the value, and then what to watch for. This is all important because as we get into really mainstream kind of leaps and bounds development in the EV space, there's a lot of excitement for new vehicles, particularly the pickup truck, the Ford F-150. None of that is going to happen without robust, ubiquitous EV charging. And that space, even there, is evolving quickly. Okay, so bread and butter, level 1 EV charging. So this is typically the kind of charger that comes with your new or used vehicle, equivalent to basically the wall outlet that is at your house. So 15 amps, you can generally plug these in anywhere. It's not really great for big battery cars because if you have a Chevy Bolt that is completely drained of charge and you're plugging in with a level 1, it's going to take a couple days. Common in the industry is referring to these acronyms. All charging stations are referred to as EVSE, which is electrician code for electric vehicle supply equipment. So if you do hear that, that's what it means. But people can get by day in only charging with level 1. and it's fine. And a lot of people have, when you have access to charging at home, at least. Stepping up to what is known as level 2, and you basically double the speed at which you're charging. When you go from charging from level 1 to level 2 at home, you often will see a lot higher utilization of your car. Our house vehicle right now is a plug-in Chrysler Pacifica minivan, which has a really small battery. But when we upgraded to a level 2, all of a sudden, when we're home for a couple hours, that battery's just charged right back up, and we're using a lot more electric miles. So level 2 is great. This is also pretty much the only charging plug format that is available to nearly every vehicle. That J772, which is the same plug set as a level 1, but offering the higher amperage with the 240 that you might see with a dryer outlet or a welder or something if you're in a garage or on a farm. Next, the complicated world of DC fast charging. So we have really 3 major players here with Tesla, CHAdeMO, and CCS, SAE. And each of these offer different charging rates via amperage. And each of them often are designed specifically for a vehicle type. You can't really cross over very easily if your car is designed for CHAdeMO. The adapters exist, they're expensive. Right now, CHAdeMO, it looks to be going away slowly. So if you have a CHAdeMO car, you probably know this, and you'll ultimately be left in a world that is going to be predominantly CCS or Tesla. Sorry. Each of them are also future driven in some regard to offer some kind of vehicle to grid capabilities. I have level 3 in quotes here because it's kind of a misnomer, because DC fast charging can be also very low. It can have a low output, and if you're talking about a 25 amp DC fast charger, that's not really super charging quite so. So I like to refer to them all as DC fast and go from there. Also, a special note on the bottom, there are new standards for wireless charging that are coming out, and so we're going to be seeing more of that in future years. And that's inductive, where you know, similar to as you're charging your toothbrush. Kind of echoing back to what Jillian was saying, is we need a lot more charging stations, period. There's going to be a lot more vehicles on the road. It's becoming more mainstream. We can go look at Norway and see if that's, take a look at what the future will look like. And with more and more EVs on the road, we need more and more charging stations, whether it be workplace or multifamily, or charging hubs to support Uber and Lyft drivers, or along the highway. This is one of those things where if you are not involved in a project right now, thinking about and forecasting when that project will happen, and start planning in advance, because each of these, especially with DC fast charging, they can be complicated and need change in order to make them happen. Okay, well, talking about the grid, because all of this energy is fantastic, and if you're planning for it, but you might not necessarily be. So generally, the slide is an indicator of how our circumstance is driven with arriving from home, plugging in your car, which means we have a big amount of peak load at the end of the day, which often is a surprise or unexpected or just unplanned for by the utility, and they're spinning up what are called peaker plants, often natural gas, just to cover that load. It's expensive. What we want instead is to move that charging load to the middle of the day or earlier in the day, or when the utility is more prepared, and what we're doing instead is lowering that peak and making better use of the renewables that we have on the system. This is overall the direction that utilities are moving with interacting with EV, and they're doing that in a variety of ways. And it's similarly to how they have learned to interact with your smart home thermostat, like a Nest. The charging station I have at my home now interacts with Portland General Electric. So if there is a peak demand, they might delay my charging for a couple hours until 8 o'clock at night. To me, does it matter? Not really, as long as the car is full when I'm ready to go in the morning. So those small moves can make big savings and help the environment. There's also a lot of money in this space. So just moving that load, again, means that they're not having to fire up peak plants, which means they're not having to invest in those plants, which means long-term that those investments can go other places. So just one small thing of doing frequency regulation. So if something is like deeply rural or needing just to true up that energy, it's a small amount of money. Moving the load, so you're actually shifting it, big amount of money. If you're able to move that peak demand from the end of the day to around lunchtime when we have peak solar, that's worth something to utility, and this is why there's a lot of investment and funds in demand response programs. This slide is not terribly up to date, but I wanted to give something that really showed like the broad network of EV charging, and this I mentioned it's out of date because this is continually being clustered and filled in. Let it just be said that there are a lot of charging stations out there and a lot more to be added soon. And something personally that excites me is they're getting faster. We pulled some information from the California Vehicle Infrastructure Program and found that more than 22% of new fast chargers are greater than 100 kilowatts. What does that mean? The West Coast Electric Highway, lots of DC fast chargers along I-5. Those are all 50 kW. So 100 kW is charging at nominally twice as fast. Increasingly, that's where the excitement is for these 150 kW, 300 kW, 350 kW fast chargers, because they're going to be able to refill your vehicle even more like you would if you were at a petrol station. There is some architecture that needs to change on EVs in general, which is why we are seeing more 800 volt systems able to take that faster charge. If you're involved in any of these projects, and when you're thinking about future proofing, you're thinking about what will this look like if I'm going to be installing a 300 kilowatt charger down the road? What changes? You know, little bits here and there, they do. And then second to last slide, just a big brief overview of like what to watch for. Medium and heavy duty for vehicles, for the infrastructure as well, it was certain to be taking off soon. There's a new charging standard there, the megawatt charging standard MCS, that I expect we'll probably see on the road more very soon. They have it installed at Daimler right now. They're playing with it. Commercial vehicle to grid, vehicle to X schools are becoming more mainstream. If you have an electric school bus, for instance, you should be talking to your utility right now. And then the excitement again about pickup trucks and other types of vehicles. I'm personally really excited about the F-150, and I think it's stuff like that that is going to really lead to a larger market acceptance where friends, families, and neighbors are thinking about EV. And then lastly, the Biden administration and other monies that will kind of circulate in this space. Certainly with, I think it's something around $7.5 billion is thought to be earmarked for EV infrastructure. And nationally, what can that do? It can do a whole lot. Real quick, just looking at questions. Are there convenient and expensive ways to schedule EV charging at home automatically? Not directly like via a charging app that I'm familiar with. I know proprietary charging apps, you can do that. You can always do that with the vehicle, though. The cars are really smart. There's kind of a back and forth of where do you want to manage your charging session, the vehicle or the charger. Either one of them you should be able to manage and set up a schedule like that. And then over answering your question about the cost of the ABB charger. I know ABB is a premium product. I know you can get less expensive products for DC fast charging. Offhand, I don't have an idea. I think probably greater than $50,000. And yes, you see ABB products everywhere, especially at bus hubs and things like that, transit centers. They use ABB technology at TriMet. And this is my contact information. Always happy to chat more about charging. And over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Zach. Great information, and especially about the DC fast chargers. We do a lot of work with those. And I want to pass over to the last, but very exciting person, Diane Hodiak, for her presentation today. Diane, please take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Hodiak, Executive Director of 350 Deschutes, and I would like to talk about overcoming barriers to mobility access for the underserved. Certainly in the space of electric vehicles, charging, pollution mitigation for these communities, and the rebates that are offered now to governments, individuals, and businesses, and particularly for those who may qualify for the low to moderate income rebate. First, I would like to draw your attention to the graphic we have in front of us. And I love this graphic. It's from Muslim Girl. And you can see the difference between equality on the left and equity on the right. And certainly we all strive for equality, but in the EV transportation world, equity is something we really want to strive for. And you see how there have been special provisions made for, well, we can look at these different individuals, and certainly that's where we want to go with this. So we're looking at equity over equality. And what this means is we want to look at the unique characteristics when we are thinking about EV charging infrastructure and EVs for low-income communities. We need to look at the physical, economic, behavioral, and attitudinal factors that will enter into how these electric vehicles and charging is used. And sometimes even as those who are implementing, we may face barriers in fixing these inequities, but it is a constant growing effort to try to overcome these inequities. One of the things I want to mention is that many of you may already be well aware that location, housing, and health inequities already exist in these communities. Most of them live close to the freeways in polluted areas, and they live with housing that often doesn't protect them. But the financial inequities are those that we really need to work at here. And I want to draw your attention to a 2017 FDIC study that showed that among the low income, 25% of households were either unbanked or underbanked, meaning that they didn't have a credit card or a debit card or a bank account. And over 50% they found didn't even have enough money to keep a bank account. 30% don't trust banks, and 9% cite the inconvenient location of banks. So when we look at that, if we look at EV charging, if we have a software program at a charging unit that is charging on a credit card and relies upon either phone or credit card, it's not going to work, is it, for many of these individuals that are so dependent on a cash culture? So how do we overcome this financial and access barrier? One of the things we can do is look at the software that's in the machine itself. And I want to point you to AmpUp, which is just one of the providers. There are others. that do have a program where they actually will discount the rates for any charging stations that are put in low-income communities. And of course, you need to qualify for that. But the other thing is if the program depends upon driver's license ID, that will also block other users as well, because there is a fair amount of license suspensions among this group that may not really have much to do with safety. So it's something that if you unblock that may really facilitate access. The other car share program that has really made good progress on this is Ithaca Car Share. What they have done is an easy access plan where members pay $10 a month, and then they pay hourly and mileage rates, which are discounted. But this has enabled more individuals to access. And then perhaps the best of all may be Austin Energy. They determined that some 36 to 40% of their residents were multifamily renters. And those statistics are relatively close across many of the states. And so they knew that they had to make their program more affordable and efficient. And when they did that, they found that they had about a 200% growth in access. So what they did is they have a program called Plug In Everywhere, where the individuals sign up. They're charged about $417 monthly. And what they can do is just go to any outlet that have been established in the system and use a plastic charging card, not a charge card, but a separate Plug In Everywhere card. The other barriers that we know are the lack of secure parking in multifamily units and public housing. So in order to overcome that barrier, we could incentivize parking lot owners to install charging stations or places of worship and or businesses, and think about how we could create reduced fee charging, which could actually, in most cases, should probably be free. And this would perhaps include incentivizing small garages in public housing. And in this case, any of these programs, you would want to target the tenants in order to make sure that you are in the right place to create these access for them. And also, it's possible that in your community, excuse me, in your community, this may require some zoning changes. So our goal is to consider all inequities, because when EV assets, when our charging stations don't meet the needs, they become unavailable for low income. And I just want to share a personal experience that we had as 350 Deschutes. We worked on a project with Central Oregon Community College and received funding from Pacific Power to do projects in Madras and Redmond. And those were really excellent communities. They were close to low to moderate income individuals, but that was only part of the picture, really. We learned just by talking with stakeholders, and both tribal and those that we work it with in our community, that they were telling us, well, I can't get a loan for an EV, or why would I even want an EV? What we learned was that education is really extremely important. And even though young people were quite interested in this and wanted to participate, that they really needed more. And California has once again come out with a new initiative called Equity 40, which is, they've actually surpassed that, but that is kind of the goal that is being promoted, is that 40 to 50% of EV charging that is allocated should actually be installed in low to moderate income communities. So what California is doing is they are installing 50% of that $1 billion that they are spending in low income communities. Biden, with the new income reconciliation bill, infrastructure reconciliation, would be allocating 40% in that, at least thus far. That's what we're seeing. So in Oregon, there is an EV-ready building code policy, but that doesn't install the units. We should be moving beyond that and requiring that EV charging be installed. And that could be something as simple as just having an outlet in a secure area, whether that's a level 1, 2, or 3. Level 1 meaning your ordinary outlet, your 2, your drier, more increased amperage, and your 3, your fast charging. But it's time that we incentivize retrofits in multifamily buildings, because that's, as we mentioned earlier, that's where most of our low income are going to be living. So if we're looking at alternative solutions and support for low-income communities and underserved, we want to create healthier communities that are really beyond EV ownership, charging, and car share. And some of those things that we can do as part of transportation actions would be to create a congestion zone in cities where we could actually encourage people not to drive in a certain area at a specific time of day. Now, we probably need enabling legislation for that, but it's certainly being talked about in Portland. The other idea would be to have a low emission zone or a zero emission zone, which would combat air pollution and help meet pollution reduction goals. And what happens here is that vehicles that travel within this area have to meet a certain pollution standard and have to be, well, in the right circumstance here, a zero emission vehicle or a very low emission vehicle. Santa Monica, California has a voluntary LEZ program, and they also have an app for electric truck deliveries, which actually constricts the heavy duty trucks from going into these communities and, spouting this diesel particulate that is so harmful to health. And cargo bikes could also be used. But another option that has already been implemented in some areas is having idle-free zones. And this would restrict diesel truck deliveries and idling in certain areas, and also school zones where buses and cars come into the area and just idle for periods of time. Bend itself has a rule, and it's a good start to have a rule, but then you have to look at enforcement too. And so some ideas on enforcement would be to get your stakeholders involved and get them talking about this. And I think once they learn about the health impacts, it's quite likely that they can get involved in trying to implement this program. But as an incentive, you could offer short-term parking for electric vehicles and trucks in a high demand parking area. That would be a wonderful incentive. You could also use automated license plate readers, and this would help law enforcement and fines. And stakeholders could also help create anti-idling toolkits, and there are many examples online. But the most important thing here with most of these projects, when you're going into any community that is underserved, you should get them involved and find out what kind of enforcement mechanisms would not be overly punitive. Get them involved in setting the goals, the boundaries of the area, the exemptions, the timing, and how that public information would be disseminated. That's just really extremely important. So why are equitable solutions in transportation and EVs so important? The main reason is when we solve for equity, we solve for everyone. And equitable solutions clean up the dirtiest air in our cities, and they make our living conditions healthier and more livable. An EV charging build-out will take a large number of polluting vehicles off the road. This will also be a big reduction to global warming. And 36 states are pushing for the equitable EV charging build-out, and only 6 have utility requirements, and Oregon is one of them. So for those of you that are interested, I would like to let you know that government, businesses, and individuals all qualify for rebates from the Oregon State Clean Fuels Program. But I recommend first off, before you plan on a rebate or a tax credit, is to visit the link I have above there. And many of these rebates, we don't really know what they're going to be yet. We know that the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, we know what those rebates are going to be, but the federal tax credit will probably be updated once that infrastructure bill gets through Congress. Currently, it's a $7,500 tax credit on a new electric vehicle, but the proposed would be up to $4,500 in additional point of sale discounts. In other words, when you buy the car rather than getting a tax credit, and this would just make it so much easier. And would also eliminate the 200,000 vehicle restriction, which Chevy Bolts fall under right now, and some other vehicles as well, the Tesla. So the Oregon Clean Fuels Program is really great because it includes just really anyone who drives. And there is a $2,500 standard cash rebate, something for motorcycles. And if you are low income qualified, and I would say low to moderate income because the criteria are very reasonable, you can actually get a $5,000 cash on the hood when you buy that car. So when you combine that with a $2,500 standard rebate, you're up to $7,500 to buy a car. So that's fairly substantial. And then also, I just recommend that you connect with your local utilities. Many utilities have programs for EVs and electrification programs. And we are lucky in Central Oregon in that Pacific Power provides grants for up to 100% for electric charging projects. And then another excellent program is PGE has up to $1,000 for home installations of EV chargers. Thank you for supporting equity and mobility. I hope you'll think about driving electric yourself. I do, and I love it.
Thanks, Diane. That was a great presentation. Very good information. I'd like to open it up now. We have about 20 minutes or so. So please put your open questions in the Q&A section, please, if you can. If not, I always have questions. And so I'll at least open it up, and this will be for the panel. Let's start with Jillian. Question I have is with the TEINA program, I know there were some other overlay programs that you worked with the websites and so on. How do you see the TEINA group, of which so many different stakeholders were working with other statewide and regional-wide agencies?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, there was a very robust stakeholder engagement process as we completed the TEINA study. And we definitely plan to continue that process and stay in touch with most, if not all, the folks that were a part of our advisory group. So some of the recommendations that came out of TEINA include convening a number of different work groups and public processes to start to implement some of the policy recommendations. And so we're working with our consultant team actually right now to get that process started. In addition, I'll say, and this is kind of an answer to another question that was asked in the chat, which is, are we working with other state agencies and the governor's office, et cetera, on these issues? And I will say, yes, extensively. We have a number of stakeholder groups that meet regularly. There's the Every Mile Counts program, which consists of 4 state agencies that meet to work on transportation electrification and other climate issues. And then there's what we call the ZEVIWIG, again, heavy on the acronyms in state government, but that's the Zero Emission Vehicle Interagency working group. And the ZEVIWIG meets monthly specifically on transportation electrification and includes the Department of Energy, Department of Administrative Services, Department of Environmental Quality, the Health Department. And so, yeah, we are constantly in contact and rely heavily on our partners and stakeholders, and we'll continue to do so as we start to move forward and enact many of these TEINA recommendations.
Thanks, Jillian, very much. Question for Zach. You mentioned in passing, but very critically, with the changing standards of CHAdeMO and the J1772, these all sound like very sophisticated numbers. And a consumer goes into the showroom to even shop, to look for an EV for the first time. How do we simplify it for those in the audience that or not necessarily intimidated, but just don't know where to start?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have heard some like horror stories of people get home or, you know, to a charging station and end up with an unfortunate surprise. I would start by looking at the OEM or the manufacturer's website, seeing what information you can gather there. Additionally, there's other good tools like ChargeAway or PlugShare, which can help to be kind of a Rosetta Stone for the system and let you know a little bit more about the car you're driving or the infrastructure around you. I think those are both good places. If all else fails, talk to the representative at the dealership. Ideally, they're giving you good, reliable information, but you might want to take that with a grain of salt, because I think it's just, in this day and age, it's always good to do your own research in advance. And there's a lot of good research out there on how to practically use these vehicles.
That's great. I will use more anecdotal information. Friends of mine have Teslas, and one of my clients drove up from California last weekend for a service call with his Tesla, but he realized that he has to have and carry with him at all times an adapter. And that's one of the things that some of us don't think about, and that is having an adapter to go to the various charging locations, because of that very fact that not every plug at this point is universal. And one thing that they looked at was, right now, with an ICE car or truck, it pretty much is the same standard. And someday there will be that standard. Question I have for Diane is, what do you see as a way to not just motivate moderate income housing sources, let's say apartments and other locations, to incentivize themselves to add at least level 1 or level 2 charging?
Well, this is the piece that, you know, I'm happy to hear that Jillian is working with other government agencies. I think the Department of, I think it's DCLU, I forget, that acronym, I can't remember the acronym, but it is the building department that comes up with the codes. What would really be great is if we could extend that requirement, that EV ready requirement that came out of Governor Brown's executive order, and extend that to require that at least an outlet be put on the exterior of buildings as a retrofit, or maybe if not a retrofit, at least new construction, because it's easier then. The retrofit is always more expensive. So if we can do something in the early construction stages, we're really ahead of the game. And looks like Jillian has a comment for this, so that's great. I'm anxious to hear what Jillian has to say.
Yes, thank you, Diane. So I do just want to mention DLCD. It's an acronym that I often can't remember as well, but the Department of Land Conservation and Development, They are in the process right now of a rulemaking called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities that is looking at a number of things, but parking ordinances is part of that process, and in particular EV charging requirements. And we have definitely weighed heavily in some of the EV charging language so that we can do exactly what you're saying, Diane, try to get the conduit laid and the electrical capacity in place during new construction when it's a whole lot cheaper than when you're going back to retrofit. So there are some things happening in that space. We also just passed HB 2180, which set targets as well for what we call EV ready parking. So hopefully stay tuned. I'll try to find the link for the public process for that rulemaking so that folks who are interested can weigh in there as well.
That's great. Thank you. And I do have a question, another question for Zach from Ray from Ashland. Ray would like to know, what is Oregon doing to plan ahead and handle the extra loads for EV charging and building out the electrical grid?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I was just writing a reply, and I think there's a lot of different planning kind of layers that go into that. I think at the local utility district, there's some really granular level of what needs upgrading and when, including just upgrading infrastructure to smarter infrastructure so that it is more resilient for the future. But on top of that, Bonneville Power has some pretty deep energy projections of what it will look like when there are a whole lot more electric vehicles on the road. So much that it is forecasted that peak demand actually will be at night because everyone's charging at night. And then that goes to inform at one level utilities' own infrastructure planning. Utilities on their own are also kind of in different capacities looking at their own potential studies to say, okay, great, we know this power is going to be needed, but where? And what will that mean? And how do we prioritize those infrastructure upgrades? Oh, and by the way, like, we have to do it in circumstance where we are having to adapt to these curveballs that are coming all the time, which means everything needs to be more resilient, period. So yeah, I can point to Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, that they're the big dogs in the fight for Oregon, but also Bonneville Power is definitely doing their own research in the space.
Thank you. Another question that I have for the panel, anyone jump in as they can. I obviously am a purveyor. I sell equipment, electric vehicle hardware, and I have questions all the time. Now I'm being informed if they are early adopters and they install the equipment of today, what will it look like in 5 years? So I think I'll ask Zach this question again. When people ask you that question from a professional standpoint, especially you as an EV adopter and user, and they say, well, why don't I just wait a few years? What do you say to that, and how do you respond?
Oh gosh, yeah. It's similar to the solar industry. Like the sooner that you're able to move into the technology, the better. I mean, just for sake of like driving an EV, it's one of the few times where you can get into a vehicle and like every day after you get into that vehicle, it's actually cleaner because the grid mix is continually getting cleaner because of the renewable portfolio standard. When installing infrastructure, particularly DC fast charging, I don't think there's any problem with installing, something that you can afford or that suits your audience. But planning for down the road can be really important. And an adage that someone told me that stuck was you want to minimize or the amount of time that you're paying an electrician to have a shovel in their hand. So the more that you can upsize conduit so that in the future you can put in larger wire, put in data needs, or be redundant, that is that is super smart. That way, if you're installing a lower amperage charger and you're going to install a higher amperage one in 5 years, you can save on some cost and just pull out the equipment and replace it. I would also add that just because of the dynamics of rates, increasingly considering installing battery storage to help mitigate some of those demand charges and add some predictability and reliability to that energy source could be something to consider too.
Well, thanks. And I have a question out here for Diane. Diane, you are a veteran EV driver. What is it like to drive an EV car for those in the audience who are considering their next vehicle to be an EV?
Thank you, Jeff. I love getting on the podium for my Chevy Bolt. Well, we started with a hybrid, went to a Nissan Leaf, and now we have one of those, as Zach referred to it, that big battery car. And I am totally confident that, you know, I'm a little bit unhappy now because of the battery situation, but I do feel it will be rectified. I feel that I will probably end up with a battery that has the 10-year warranty and starts from scratch. So to me, I think that's fair. I think it's been wonderful not to have a stinky garage. And the only difference I note is that I do have to plan my trips now. If I want to go to Portland, I can make it all the way to Portland from Bend because it's downhill. Coming back, I do have to stop for a little charge, and I know where I can do that. I can do it for free at Central Oregon Community College. So that's the difference. I don't have stinky hands anymore from handling that gas, and I don't have to worry about the fumes. I mean, those are just the small benefits, but and I'm just amazed at what a fast, reliable, low maintenance, and I mean, I haven't done anything for our Bolt that is 2 years old other than rotate the tires. Nothing. Oh, I'm probably going to have to put wipers on it. So, yeah.
That's great. Another question for Jillian, please, from a higher 20,000 foot view. What's the next steps for you and the group and other stakeholders, and how can we participate? Those of us that are here today and others in the state of Oregon, how would you like us to assist with your programs?
Yeah, that's great. So as I mentioned, we are working right now with our consultant team to put together this what we're calling the zero emission vehicle charging deployment strategy. So this is taking that high level TEINA findings, bringing it to ground level and actually looking at where do we need charging in the next 2 to 5 years. One of the key pieces of that process is that we're hoping to turn some of our modeling, our spreadsheets, our GIS maps into tools for local policy makers and decision makers so that they can more easily take a look at some of the findings and apply it to their specific geographic regions. And so especially if you're involved in, you know, the local community or county at the county level, I would say definitely check our TEINA website or the Climate Office website at ODOT. You have my contact information. Get in touch with me, and I'll definitely let you all know where we are in that process and when those materials will be available to the public, but also to other public workers. In addition, as I mentioned, we're going to be convening a number of work groups with all of our stakeholder partners, utilities, but also folks from the EV industry, EV drivers, EV advocates. And some portions of those work groups will include a public process. I don't have any more information on it than that right now, except to say that it is coming and to stay tuned, and check our website, get in touch with me, and I will happily share that information when it's available.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for the presentation today. And I'll turn it over to Diane to wrap it up for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you for that fabulous presentation, all of you. So I just want to remind people about our next panel, which is managing construction waste and demolition, and also next tomorrow at noon, commercial property assessed clean energy and solar for everyone, which should be absolutely really great because I think there should be no reason why someone should not be able to get solar. So they're going to talk about that. And so community solar, of course, is the answer for those. But please, before you go today, we just have one last word from 350 Deschutes. And if you would also, please remember to fill out that survey that you will see pop up at the end of this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, my name is Jeff Rollet. I'm a board member with 350 Deschutes. Every year, we offer the Go Clean Energy Conference, bringing our guests valuable content to help save this fragile planet and improve our quality of life. We'd like to continue to offer this conference for free, but we need your help. You can help by donating $10, $20, $50 or more. Just go online to 350deschutes.org/donate. Again, that's 350deschutes.org/donate. And go clean energy. Thank you so much.